Welcome back to Arguing with the Internet. Today's episode, should we trust science? Now, this is something that's come up a lot recently with people saying online, trust science, or trust scientists, follow the science, these types of things. And you see this a lot in discussions of things like climate change, vaccines, or COVID restrictions. And often, when people are talking about this online, it's not really an argument, it's more of a statement of political identity. I'm the type of person that believes in science, or I'm the type of person who likes to think for myself and I'm not beholden to these experts. And this is an issue that's very personal to me because I am a scientist and I like to think I know a thing or two, and also that people should respect what I have to say, at least if I have expertise in that. So today we're going to try a bit of a different format where we actually find arguments happening online, talk about them, and try to flesh out the best way to think about these topics. So do you have one for us, Matt?
Yeah, so this first argument comes from Reddit, where all the best internet arguments are found.
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
so this Reddit user says, quote, "We don't need to trust scientists. They can still be bought. But we do need to trust the scientific method," end quote. This is very short and sweet, but there's actually a lot to unpack here, I think. The
Mm-hmm.
first thing that I want to draw out of this is that there's this important distinction to be made between trusting science and trusting scientists in a more
Mm-hmm.
individualistic way, right? Um, Science, more broadly construed, could be something like the community of scientists at large, or uh, like science as maybe even a body of knowledge or some kind of practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But individual scientists is a completely different story when it comes to whether or not we should trust them, right? You mentioned in the intro that you have certain expertise, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
for those who don't know, Lewis is a neuroscientist, right? So you have a certain expertise when it comes to certain things about the brain, right? Would that be fair to
Yeah.
say?
Yeah.
Um,
A pretty limited set of things. Like
yeah, as any
like a
good
very
neuroscientist
niche
should
field. Yeah.
say, right? Uh, um, so if you then, qua scientist, were to try and speak on something to do with sociology, right,
Mm-hmm.
or some other form of science, right, like organic chemistry. Maybe neuroscience requires some knowledge of organic chemistry, but maybe your expertise in that field is limited, right?
Right.
Should we trust you just because you're a scientist? No, obviously not, right? Um, that's not how it works. It's
Right.
also true, as this Reddit user brings up, that individual scientists can be bought, right? Now, there's a couple of different ways to unpack that. One is to say that scientists, at least individually, can be corrupted by like corporate interest, right? That a company with less than virtuous intent could employ a scientist to produce the results that they want, right? That's kind of the
Just
fear.
hand them a big bag of money, basically,
Yeah,
to do what they want.
yeah,
But at the same time, there could be, probably what happens more typically is there's conflicts of interest where, like maybe when people were studying whether cigarettes cause lung cancer, some of the
hmm
scientists say that got money from cigarette companies. And even if the cigarette companies didn't directly say you need to show that it doesn't, cigarettes don't harm people.
right,
If that's where your money's coming from, you're going to have a strong bias to find evidence in favor of what they're trying to get.
right. There's also some fear that I think it's kind of kicking around out there nowadays, where some scientists might be more politically biased, right? So it's not just
Mm,
about where their money's coming from, but it might also be about what kind of results they want to see out there for political reasons, right?
mm-hmm.
whether or not these things happen, I mean, it's the economic side, at least when it comes, like the example you mentioned, cigarettes, that sort of thing. These things have happened in the past, right? There has been a sort of economic tarnishing of specific scientists, right? Whether or not this political biasing is occurring and to what extent, I'm not really sure. But I think we could at least say it's possible, right?
Right.
It's
Sure.
possible. And if it's possible, then maybe you shouldn't just blindly trust any one individual scientist, even if they
Sure.
are speaking within their realm of expertise, right? Maybe you should still look more broadly, right? But that's different from saying we shouldn't trust science in general, right? There's quite a big difference there. And this Reddit user seems to be on board with that distinction, as they say that we do need to trust the scientific method, right? So it's like science, real science, right? Our science done the way it's supposed to be, we can trust. But we can't trust scientists who, go to the dark side or whatever.
Right. But that's pretty hard to make that work, I guess, because like I'm a scientist, of course, but as you alluded to, I don't know everything. I'm not an expert in everything, and I'm expert in very limited area of research. And so if I want to know something about climate change, of which I have no qualifications for, study biology, don't know anything about the physics involved in that. I could try to read the scientific papers, but I'm not really going to understand them. I kind of have to take someone else's word for it, and that person's probably going to be a scientist. Like I would believe a scientist. Maybe other people would find some other authority figure, but I feel like you do have to. There's only so much you could do to try to figure it out on your own. So you do need to trust a scientist or someone in authority, at least.
Maybe. Right? So I agree with the notion that there's going to be a point at which you no longer have the resources to pursue the topic yourself, right? Like, if, for instance, if you're interested in learning the truth or whatever about climate change, there are, the methods of experimentation and things like that, many of these things are not just going to be accessible to you, right? They're far too costly or require special education that you don't have, right? There's too much to do in order to do the work yourself. So ultimately, if you want to draw a conclusion about this topic, you're going to have to rely on someone else. Right. But you don't have to draw a conclusion, right?
I guess that's true. Yeah.
You could remain neutral. You could say, well, I don't know if I should trust this science stuff, right? And therefore, I'll remain neutral, right? Now,
it's hard to remain completely neutral. I guess it depends on what the topic is. But for vaccines, for instance, if you're trying to decide, should I vaccinate my child? If you're going to be neutral in that, that's basically saying, no, I shouldn't, because there's no way to kind of find a middle ground there. You're either going to vaccinate your child or you're not.
Well, with some things that are action-based, like vaccination, sure, remaining neutral is still taking a certain kind of position. That's true. But for other things, maybe not so much, right? Having said that, though, most of the, science skeptics that we see today, well, I guess vaccines are a big one right now, but just before the pandemic, the big thing was flat Earth, right? That was the big not necessarily anti-science, but skeptical of established science, let's say, movement that there was at that time, right? Now it's certainly anti-vaxxers, but at that time it was flat Earth. It seems to me that while you could take this position of being neutral, most of these science skeptics aren't really doing that, right? It's I can't trust the established line coming from science, right? Or established science, whatever. Um, so I'm going to infer these other conclusions, you know? I'm going to then reach towards these other conclusions, not remain neutral. It's not, oh, well, I don't really know whether the earth is a globe or not. It's no, the earth is definitely flat, right? The earth is definitely flat, which is a little worrying. If you are going to be in a position in which you're going to critique science, if you're going to be skeptical of it, you should probably use that same skepticism elsewhere, when it comes to forming your beliefs and things like that. Otherwise,
Right. So if you want to be skeptical of scientific institution or the story that scientists are painting, yeah, it's that's one thing to say. I don't know, like I don't necessarily trust what these people are saying, but I don't really know. It's quite another thing to say, no, I have this other idea that I think is right based on doing a little internet searching or just stuff you've kind of come up with. Like you would have to be very confident in your abilities to make that work.
Yeah, exactly. So we haven't yet gotten to any of the arguments that suggest that we should be skeptical of science as like a practice or anything like that. But we will. And when we get there, note that while it's okay to be skeptical of science, be consistent. Apply the same measure to your other beliefs as well. Otherwise, I mean, you're not playing fair, so to speak, right? We ought to remain consistent, right, in our beliefs here. But yeah, so anyway, back to the comment here. They suggest that what's important is not the individual scientist, but the scientific method. And this is something that I see quite a lot online. The scientific method is sort of like enshrined. This thing is what makes science so good, right? This thing is what makes science so valuable and virtuous, right? At least epistemically virtuous. I'm not convinced, right? I'm not convinced. One, because it's not at all clear that there is a method shared universally amongst scientists, right? Would you agree with that?
I I think so. Especially thinking of what you learned in school, the scientific method of you got to observe and then come up with the question, like a hypothesis, and then test that hypothesis. I don't even remember all the steps because I don't do that, and I don't know
Right.
anybody who does do that. I'm not saying no scientists do that, but scientists, I mean, they do come up with questions. They test hypotheses, but it's very rarely as regimented as that. You don't normally say like, "I have a hypothesis. How do I test this hypothesis?"
Right.
It's a lot of that time it comes after the fact when you're writing the paper. You're like, "This is what I hypothesize." And like,
Sure.
you know, um, and you kind of use a variety of methods that would all seem scientific, but that's not necessarily one thing that's going to bind them together. And then different disciplines, like in neuroscience, experiments are king. You want to do a true experiment whenever possible, but like astrophysics, you can't do a real experiment. You can't randomly assign a star to go supernova. So you have to use completely different set of ways of testing different ideas, but you'd still call that science even if there's no experiments.
Right. And the sort of experiments you're going to find between the sciences are going to be totally different in kind, right? So, for example, in neuroscience, or at least in molecular neuroscience, you might be making like interventions in cells or even in genes or things like that. You're actually like poking around in the stuff, right? Whereas in other fields, maybe even other fields of neuroscience, the way you conduct experiments is by creating models, right? And observing what happens when you engage with these models in certain ways. That's a that's a totally different thing than forming a hypothesis and observing the world, right? No, you are creating a facsimile of the world to some extent, right? And making observations of that, right? This isn't an observation of the real phenomena at all, right? So
Mhm.
it's it's just not clear that there is any one universal scientific method, at least in the way that we're taught, in junior high or wherever, right?
Right. That's definitely
it,
overly simplistic. You can maybe make some elaborate, description of different kinds of scientific practice, but that's a lot more complex than just the scientific method.
mhm. Yeah. But if the scientific method isn't the thing that is securing science this authority or this place of value, what is it? I think
Right.
maybe this argument that you pulled will actually lead us into that if we want to
Okay.
take a
Yeah.
look at that.
Yeah. So here's another comment. This one is from Cora. Um, and the original question is, can we trust the science? So this person answers proper peer review, proper peer reviewed scientific journals, reported in full and not interpreted and condensed by some journalists with minimal knowledge of the subject. Yes, you can mainly trust them. And they go on to say, for big established theories like evolution, gravity, relativity, and the like, people have been trying and failing to disprove them for generations. If they could disprove something like this, it would be worldwide headline news and they'd win Nobel Prizes. These theories are absolutely trustworthy. And so this person's doing a couple different things here. So in that first comment I read, they're talking about how you can trust science that's in scientific journals. So scientists will perform experiments or do some kind of studies and then publish them in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And reporters may write about that science and sensationalize it and mischaracterize it. And so maybe that you can't trust, but the actual journal articles themselves you can trust. And then the second point is more about how different types of theories have been so successful at explaining different phenomenon, and people have been trying to test those theories and disprove them, and they have stood the test of time, at least for 100 years or so. And so that leads credibility to how trustworthy these things are. So do you have any thoughts about that, Matt?
Yeah, so going back to the last one we saw, where we kind of saw that you can't really appeal to this notion of the scientific method to secure science's honored place. This
Mm-hmm.
person seems to be suggesting that what's actually making science I don't know what the right word is here. So secure, perhaps, is that it engages in peer review, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not allowed to just write something and put it out there and with no criticisms at all, right? Ideally, ideally, a scientific paper goes through this like rigorous process of criticism, right? That's the idea
Mm-hmm.
behind peer review. You are judged by other experts who try their best to criticize the experiment, etc., to determine whether or not the paper is worthy, right? Maybe that's why science is so good, right?
Right, I could see that where yeah, for scientists to make a claim, it has to go through this pretty rigorous process of people who are also experts in the field looking at their work and determining whether it's up to snuff, like it's done in a quality way that makes the results trustworthy. So there's that internal mechanism whereby science um, can be more reliable and worthy of trust.
But the interesting thing here is that this appeal to peer review is relying on another notion that I think is we've already sort of brushed past a little bit that I think is doing a lot of work here. So, for example, uh, there are there are communities that believe in things like the flat Earth theory, for example, that
Mm-hmm.
do their own experiments and engage in a similar form of practice, right? They look at one another's experiments. They talk about them a lot. These
That's
people
true.
engage in conversation a lot on the internet,
Hmm.
right? So in some manner, they seem to be engaging in the same sort of practice. So why is their peer review not leading to this esteem that the peer review that establishment science gains, right? I think it's ultimately because as you kind of said as you were telling your story there, um, it's reviewed by experts, right? It's reviewed
Hmm.
by experts. So I think what's really behind all of this is just this notion of expertise, right?
Hmm.
Scientists have some kind of expertise, but what could this expertise be? Is it just the education that they've had?
Yeah, I wouldn't think it's just the education. I mean, I don't know. That's a interesting point. Yeah, it's people who do this for their career in established fields, so they're associated with universities who are already established as places of academic learning, and the people who are experts. So they're sort of like vouching for these people to say that
Right.
they know what they're talking about. Where people who are in flat Earth, they don't have any kind of established way of earning credibility. You can't get a PhD in flat Earthism, as far as I know. Maybe
Right.
somewhere you can. There's no previously established institution that vouches for those individuals.
Right.
But having said all that, that does that makes it sound more shallow, I guess. That it's just like, oh, like these people say it's okay. And I want to say there's
Well,
more to that.
I think you'll find that when you talk to or when you read these arguments from camps like the Flat Earth camp, etc., even more modern anti-vax camps, uh, they will often make claims like that's exactly what your expertise amounts to. It's just that you've been vouched for by some established entity, right? But there's no reason to think that might not just be indoctrination, right? Maybe these institutions are just indoctrinating people, right? You think you're getting an education, but you're just towing the party line, right? You're just
Mm-hmm.
following what you've been told in the past. Um, and I think the most common response to that is going to be something like, uh, "That's all well and good to say theoretically, but when you actually get in a lab and you can see, you can observe the things occurring in real time. It's not just that you're taking someone's word for it. You're actually seeing the results for yourself as well, right?
Exactly. It's the success of the scientific institution, I think, that gives it a lot of credibility. So, in line with the second part of this person's comment, where they talk about
Mm-hmm.
things like the theory of evolution being so, um, like people have not been able to disprove that, and they've been very successful. I mean, the theory of evolution has given us a lot of insight into how our bodies work. Um, a ton of like all of biology in some ways kind of based on evolution or is reliant on evolution. And so the ability of scientists to also they discover principles that lead to new technologies, these things that have tangible impacts on our lives, whereas the science that's done by flat earthers is not, it doesn't inspire as much awe. A lot of the, at least the what I'm familiar with, a lot of the experiments they try to do, they're not super convincing.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to that. I've only seen a couple myself, and well, like most things in science, there are ways of explaining uh, failure to arrive at your initial prediction, right? That don't have to do with rejecting your hypothesis. So there's all kinds of ways you can explain why your experiment didn't go according to plan. Um, but yeah, so back to this comment you found here. I mean, the first section of it is just an admonishing of science being communicated by non-experts, right? So, should you trust science as presented by journalists without any kind of expertise? No, says this person, right? That's I see where they're coming from, right? If they don't have expertise, then the likelihood of them being able to communicate things 100% accurately, is slightly diminished. It's still possible that they could get it right, right? But I'm not sure it's entirely realistic to expect scientists, especially those engaged in like cutting edge research, to be able to engage with the public in such a way that the public's going to understand, what they're doing, right? And
Yeah, typically
therefore, without these non-expert journalists, you might never know about some of these advances, right?
Yeah, that is true. I mean, scientists, when they're trying to explain what they're doing to people who are not experts, it was often very difficult because you're used to talking to experts and using all this jargon and whatnot. But typically, you do have to simplify things quite a bit for someone who's has no knowledge of your field at all to understand. And in some ways, that's wrong. You're simplifying to the point where it's not actually
It's false.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's false, but there seems to be some truth to it. Though. So they're getting the person you're explaining it to sort of understands more than they did before, even if what you told them wasn't exactly true.
Right.
Because I mean, that's just the way it is in anything. Like my understanding of my field of expertise, I know that I can never really understand any other field the way an expert can, just because I know that if I try to explain something that I'm an expert into somebody, they're not going to quite understand it in the way that I do. It's just, you need that time and commitment to learning all that sort of stuff. And so you kind of have to settle for being a little wrong in your understanding.
Yeah, but in general, though, this notion that you shouldn't trust at all, like an experiment that's been interpreted by a journalist or something like that. Like, if we're okay with saying what you just did, where we say, well, listen, in order to get across some of the knowledge that they've gained, scientists sometimes have to distill their findings so that the public can understand them. If we're okay with that, then I don't know why we wouldn't be okay with non-expert journalists also reporting on scientific findings. Now, granted, there's going to be some non-expert journalists who overly sensationalize, and we see this all the time. New cure for cancer in a month, right? and things like that all the time. But I don't think we should throw them all under the bus, right? I would like to think that it's possible that
different outlets do it better
journalist.
than others. So
Yeah, I mean they are more experienced with communication toward the public, at least, than scientists are. Most scientists, I think, at least in my experience, are pretty bad at communicating.
Some scientists are terrible at communicating to other scientists, like communicating to the lay public.
Yeah, and once again, I get slightly to return to a former topic. This invoking of the notion of expertise, I'm still not exactly clear what makes a scientist an expert. I mean, we briefly hit on, well, they seem to come from these institutions that we we grant some credit to, right? And that seems to, in some way, like they inherit expertise from that. But I mean, you can get a degree in a field of science with a C average, right? I'm not sure that everyone who practices science is an expert. So I don't know that we can say all scientists are experts in their field, right? We can't preclude the notion that there are bad scientists, right? There's bad everything. There's got to be bad scientists.
I would attest personally that they're bad scientists. I mean, I'm not gonna name names or anything, but like there are
uh,
scientists who I think yeah don't do good science.
so
Um,
if being a professional scientist isn't enough to secure you the expertise we're looking for, I'm still at a loss as to what it is then that grants you that honorific, right? What makes you the expert? Maybe it's like having successfully gone through this peer-reviewed process. Maybe that sort of demonstrates your chops or something like that.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was trying to think of examples of like tangible benefits. So, for instance, like certain physics theories or new understandings in physics lead to new technologies, um, more or less directly. Then
Mm-hmm.
you can use that as an example of okay, here's an instance where this type of science led to this very demonstrable and good outcome, and so we maybe grandfather in other types of science that are similar,
Mm.
um, because not every field of science is going to have that clear um,
So
link
are
where
are you suggesting then that if you can apply the results of some kind of scientific finding in a way that's like tangibly obvious of its
mhm.
success, right? Then that implies expertise on behalf of those who were involved. Is that what you're suggesting?
Right, I'm suggesting that's one way you could get there, and that's probably the to me that's it seems like a perhaps the easiest way to assign value to science that you do not understand very well,
Mm.
because you could see that people did the science that directly led to these technological innovations, for instance, or
Mm-hmm.
drug treatments, whatever, um, some kind of tangible benefit. Because otherwise, it could be like, oh, these scientists, they came up with these theories and they're testing all this stuff, and that's a cool story. But how do I
Right.
know that that's in any way, a good story or a good way of producing knowledge?
I see where you're going with that, but that's a pretty high bar. You know what I mean? That's we're gonna have yeah, have there been results of science that have had tangible impacts on the world? Yeah, it seems pretty clear that there have been, uh, but not all science does that kind of thing,
Right. So
right?
this is why I'm trying to make an extra move where to establish that some science does lead to these tangible benefits,
Mm-hmm.
and then from that you say, okay, this method of inquiry, this method of producing knowledge in general is good, and so you
Well, now we're back on
other
this notion
fields that do
of
that,
method, though, right? And I
yeah,
thought we had already agreed that we're not convinced that there's a universal method shared by scientists. So I
yeah,
don't know that we can appeal to method here to grandfather in these other people, right? Especially those who are so divorced from producing tangible consequences. Like I don't
mm-hmm.
know, some kind of like theoretical like cosmologist or something like that. Now, this reveals my lack of expertise. Perhaps cosmologists do produce results that are tangible in the world. I have no idea. But I would imagine less so than someone engaged in like biomedical research, you know, where the aim is to produce these tangible results. Um,
Right,
but I don't
yeah,
want to say that these cosmologists aren't experts, right?
mhm.
Just because they aren't producing these like results that more or less get translated into technology, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess I see your point without fleshing out, what is it that makes something science? And what is it that leads to these innovations? And how can we, apply that to other domains? That is, I mean, it's maybe something you could do, but it's as we said earlier, it's a little trickier than just like one method. But yeah, maybe that's not the best way to confer expertise to these individuals.
But without some notion of expertise, I'm not sure where we're at, right? Because it seems like once you lose this idea of there being a method that joins all of science, right? And that method, because it's so good, is what makes science good and trustworthy. Once you lose that, it seems like you have to rely on something like, well, the scientists are experts. That's why we should trust them. If you want to make that move, right? That
Mm-hmm.
we should trust science, like as a community or a practice or something like that. But if you can't say why they have expertise in what they do, then it's going to be a difficult move to make. Um,
Right. You could perhaps point to something like predictions, where people, by doing science, can make predictions about things that have not been observed yet. So, doing all the work in
mhm.
evolution and genetics, all these sorts of things, you can make predictions about certain species you haven't seen yet, or things of that nature. And in instances where you can do that, you can make kind of a called shot there. Then that confers a level of expertise.
Yeah,
Uh,
maybe.
and I think like, but I think like different fields are definitely better or worse at predicting things like novel
Right.
phenomena. Like, um,
Evolutionary biology, you know, you mostly looking backwards, right? So
right.
it's not at all clear even what their predictions would look like, um, or how they would go about making them, right?
Mm, well, yeah. I don't know of specific examples for that, but certainly like physics and chemistry, like those are good examples of sciences that make predictions that, like the few years ago, the Higgs boson
Mm-hmm.
particle, like that was theorized to be, it would be observed under these circumstances, and then scientists, built an apparatus to test that, and it was the results were consistent with that prediction.
Mm-hmm.
But not all sciences are physics and chemistry; they're much more, much harder to make very clear predictions that if you've succeeded in making them, or finding results that are consistent with them or not.
Right. Yeah, certainly. Um, there is this one view in the philosophy of science wherein science isn't a special thing in and of itself, sort of uh, aside from other forms of inquiry. Instead, it just is a practice of using good, like, general thinking skills, right? That we have just sort of shoved off to its own side because of the things it studies. But it uses the
Mm-hmm.
same tools, right? Here we're talking about like fallibilistic thinking, right? Which is going in thinking that you could be wrong about this, right? I could be wrong about the conclusions that I'm ultimately going to draw. Revisability, right? So when I reach my conclusion, I'm willing to accept that at some point I might have to come back and change things up, right? I might discover something else in the future that causes me to reevaluate what I've done. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and this notion of objectivity, right? To try your best to control for things like, I mean, in some fields we would say bias. In science, we're more interested in things like confounding variables, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could send you, false positives or negatives, right? Uh, the idea behind this view is that those things aren't unique to science. Those things are just what it means to think well, right? That just is thinking well. And so maybe scientists aren't expertise or maybe scientists aren't experts in some unique way. Maybe they're just trained to think well, right? Maybe that's all that it amounts to. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. Um, Being trained to think well in specific sort of contexts, where I'm trying to think of how it would be different from like history or other fields of inquiry, um, where maybe it's more methodological in terms of, in history you're trying to find new knowledge by studying documents, whereas in science you're trying to find new knowledge by making observations and doing experiments, or whatever. There's certain methodological differences there, but really they're sort of, those different disciplines are combined, or very similar in terms of that they're just different ways of thinking well, and just having different methods or different avenues of exploration for that. I mean, I could see that.
Well, when you keep the thinking skills more general, like the
Mhm.
revisability of conclusions and going in with a fallibilistic mindset, that sort of thing, I don't see that there is very much of a difference between something like history and something like a field of science. Right. You mentioned that they might differ in how they go about their methodologies, but once again, there doesn't seem to be a unified method for science. Right. A sociologist, maybe what they do is going to look a lot more like the historian than what you do as a neuroscientist. Right.
Mhm.
Where a sociologist, as part of their experiment, maybe they just go around and talk to people. Right. They ask people questions. Right. And that's part of their experiment. A historian could do the same thing, right? Go around, ask for firsthand accounts, right? Uh, I think this notion of methodology grounding out the science is one that we're gonna keep coming back to time and time again, but it just doesn't seem like it's doing the work people need it to do here. Um,
Right. So yeah, we sort of muddied the waters a bit. Um, but I think I don't know if we're going to reach a consensus for this issue, but I would like to talk more about the second part of this question,
yeah,
where this person's talking about theories like evolution, general relativity, for instance. Um, these as being so good and indicative of why science is a trustworthy institution because people have been trying to disprove them and they can't, or they at least so far have not. Um,
that's not
and
what
they
they
have.
say.
Okay.
You made what they said more
I guess I'm
reasonable.
editorializing a little bit, but they
Yeah, you
said,
made it far
if
more
they
reasonable.
if they could disprove something like this, it would be, you know, big news. They win Nobel prizes. Because that has not happened, the theories are trustworthy.
Absolutely trustworthy is what they say.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That notion that you built in there where it's like, well, they haven't been disproven yet. Nah. That
I
sort of
guess
like,
most people aren't going to say that, like with evolution, they're like, it's a fact, even though it's called a theory, it's like a fact, and they're not
uh-huh.
going to say it's even possible that it's wrong because it's so, uh, it's it's been so successful. People have not been able to disprove it, or at least it's the countervailing, or it's the primary way that people who are experts in this domain think about things. Um,
Yeah, but I think historically that's been said about a lot of things, right? A lot of things that we now think are false. Or there's another critique from the philosophy of science um, that comes from this more historical point of view that says more or less, listen, we've had a lot of scientific views in the past, and most of them we don't hold anymore, right?
mhm.
Most of the things that scientists have concluded in the past, we now think are false. Therefore, we might expect that we'll find the same about our currently held theories later. Now,
Mm.
uh, you can't get a there's no valid conclusion there in terms of like you can't say we will find that these theories are false in the future. You can't say that. Maybe we got it right this time. Maybe this time we did it right. Possible. But it's instead this sort of trying to soften confidence, right? That those people back then, they were also very confident in what they believed. But we no longer believe those things, right? We no longer believe that illnesses are caused by an imbalance of humors, or that the uh, the sun rotates around the Earth, right, as well as all the other all the planets, right? Um, these things were once held very strongly.
Yeah.
Maybe they were held to be absolutely trustworthy, right?
Well, this is something. It's a sentiment I think certain scientists that I've encountered anyway do express is that who knows, we might be wrong one day, or
Mm-hmm.
it's really ridiculous to think we know everything, we figured it all out. But at the same time, I think people in any field of biology are going to have a hard time saying evolution could even possibly be false, because there's some famous quote that's like, well, I should have looked this up before, but basically like biology doesn't work without evolution. Like we can't do biology as we understand now without having the theory of evolution. It's so integral into that field. But just because of that doesn't mean it's true. I mean, we have the example of like Newton's laws of gravity. They were absolutely integral to anything you were going to do with like planetary motion. And they were extremely successful in their predictive power. But they turned out to not be true. And it just took more sort of unusual circumstances, like where you have a ton of gravitational pull, to really see the limitations of that. And so, as you said, like because it's happened in the past before, we could also be at that point now where,
right,
even if it seems like we cannot think of a possible other explanation of how this could be the case, that doesn't mean it's true necessarily.
Right. So when people say like, oh, you should trust science, right? And what they mean by that is what this person has just said, right? There are these views which are incontrovertible. That's not what they said, but it's close enough. That I have a problem with, right? Because in a certain way, what they're suggesting is an unscientific view of these scientific findings, right? If we think of science in that way I suggested earlier, where it's more or less just an embracing of these like good ways of thinking, right? Revisability is always in there, right? There might come a time, even though perhaps right now we can't see it, like for the biologist and evolution, as you were talking about earlier, even if we can't see it right now, if something did come along, if some new insight came along, in principle, we have to be amenable to it, right? We have to at least consider it, right? Could we be wrong? Yes. We should always accept that we could be wrong, right? That's that fallibilistic mindset, right? So this suggestion that the way you trust science is by believing in the current results of, science, or at least established science, it seems wrong-headed to me, right? That seems like you're trusting in something, but it's not trusting in science, right? You're trusting in like, I don't know, like the current status quo, right, or something like that. Not quite the same thing,
right? So to think scientifically, you're saying like you should have kind of a skeptical approach to everything. So when you're doing science, you're trying to understand how the world works. So you're open to different possibilities, but you should also be open to the possibility that these long-held established beliefs could be wrong. You could always encounter something you haven't considered before that makes you rethink your assumptions.
You don't have to like grant an enormous amount of weight to this like doubt or whatever, but you shouldn't make claims like these theories are absolutely trustworthy, right? That's a step too far, is the complaint that I have here, right? We might say, and scientists do say all the time when they're communicating with the public, listen, yeah, we call these theories, but they're basically facts, right? And they do say that, but at the same time, there has to be this understanding that while that's accepted now, there is some mere possibility, right, that things might change in the future, right? You can just never know. You never, unless you know what the alternative theory is, you can't really assess how strongly it competes. So, for example, before Einstein, or before any notion of relativity, there's no way for scientists who are deeply convicted by Newtonian physics, right? There's no way for them to know that their views can be challenged effectively. There's no way for them to know because they haven't been exposed to it, right? So For them in that time then to have said, oh, these theories are absolutely trustworthy, seems just as true for us now, right? There's no way to know what the new challenger will be like, if there will be one. Maybe we did get it right this time, right? It's possible, but we have to accept, if we're going to think of science as this sort of fallibilistic practice where we accept that we might have to revise our conclusions based on new evidence, we have to accept that these things are revisable, right? We can always come back.
Yeah. I do think that, I don't want to read into this person's mind too much.
Sure.
But I do think that a lot of times when people say this, particularly with evolution, it may be a defensive posture because someone who believes in creationism might say like, oh, evolution is just a theory. My theory is just as good, or, it's not proven. Or you could say the same thing with like flat earthers. They'll say like, oh, the earth being round, that's just a theory or whatever. And so scientists will sort of double down on the position like, no, it's absolutely true. Like we have proven this, like there's no way this could be wrong, as a way to sort of combat the skepticism. Whereas if there weren't people that were as skeptical, maybe they would be more amenable to saying, this could always be wrong.
Right. Yeah, I think you're likely right. But to me, like the best way of handling that kind of thing is to talk about differences in the quality of theory rather than to insist that your theory is something more, right? Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, like the flat earther, creationist, whatever, when they say, hey, it's just a theory, technically speaking, that's the right move, right? Technically speaking, yeah, it is just a theory, right? It is not. And it is not science will never, if it's operating correctly, under the narrow definition I've given or whatever, it's not in the business of establishing facts that are solid and can never and will never change, right? It might be that we uncover something that really is fact, right? But you aren't going to be able to appreciate it as a fact that way, right? It's always just going to be a theory. That doesn't mean that all theories are of the same quality, right?
Right.
So if you are feeling defensive or whatever when you're engaging with someone who says gravity, that's just a theory, or evolution, that's just a theory. Sure, it is just a theory, but let me tell you why it's a better theory, right? It's more useful in terms of prediction, explanation, etc. There's all kinds of ways you can approach that. You don't have to insist that it's fact and then come off as some kind of dogmatist, right?
Right. No, I think that is a good point. Well, do you think we should move on to the next question?
Yeah, let's jump on to the next one. So this is an argument between multiple people from Twitter. So first up, we have someone saying trust the science is the most anti-science thing you can say. Questioning everything, particularly the results, is how you do science. Okay, someone kind of joins in with them, in my mind, of the same alignment, right? Who says, they say trust the science, but they actually mean trust the science, but only when we agree with it and it matches our political agenda. Okay, so these two, this first comment is actually a fairly, it's simplistic, but it's also nuanced at the same time. It's actually a criticism of recent scientific findings. I think this person was actually responding to vaccines, right? This was something to do with vaccines, right? So saying trust the science is the most anti-science thing you can say. Telling me that I should get the vaccine, just trust the scientist, is unscientific. Why? Because science requires us to question everything, particularly the results. So this is a way of turning the fallibilism inherent in science, the I could be wrong about this, right? Inherent in science, around against it, right? So I should adopt a similar mindset when it comes to the conclusions reached by scientists, right?
Yeah.
So do we want to jump to the reply, or should we talk about
Yeah, I
this
think this
first?
is some of that stuff is similar to what we've touched on
Mm-hmm.
already. So yeah, I think we can jump into the reply to
Okay.
um, both of those.
So responding here, we have an actual argument in terms of a heated exchange, not a philosophical argument, right? This person says, no, they mean trust the scientific consensus, the prevailing conclusions of the foremost experts in the field, and the esteemed governing agencies of those scientists, like the CDC. Perhaps you're referring to the anti vaxxers, anti maskers, and the like. So here, this person is making the claim that, uh, well, more or less in the background, the claim that they're making is that what's important, what secures science, this esteemed position, is this consensus, right? The
Mm-hmm.
reason why you should trust in the conclusions coming out of science is because there's a consensus amongst experts, right? Um, it's not just one person saying something, right? Again, this kind of hits back on this notion of peer review, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this community wide sort of embracing of certain theories. Um, you see this
I
kind of
think
rebuttal a lot with the anti-vax stuff and with climate change, right? Uh,
yeah.
Typical rebuttal goes, practically every scientist thinks that the Earth is undergoing uh, climate change that will be harmful to life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is in some way supposed to secure the notion that climate change is going to be harmful to living things, right? Or us, more
Yeah. Yeah,
specifically.
that's just it's definitely something that comes up a lot in online arguments. Like you said, climate change. There was some study that came out that said 97% of climate scientists agree
Mm-hmm.
that climate change is man-made and is real. I haven't read that study. I don't know anything about it, but other people say the number is higher. But all this, I think, is sort of a reaction to a sort of both sizing narrative where if you're talking about climate change, you might have think of it as there's a climate expert who says climate change is real, it's man-made, we should do something about it, it's going to be really bad, and then you have another potential expert who says no, it's either not real or it is real but it's
Mm-hmm.
not man-made, or it is real, maybe it's man-made but it's not something we should worry about. And so if you have two experts who are saying opposite things, one way to get around you know the question of who to believe is to come up with this consensus statement where you say the people who are deemed to be experts in this field, 99% of them believe this thing. Well, that's what you should believe. If you, especially if you're not an expert, you should trust the majority opinion here. And that, it makes sense to me, like intuitively. I think makes sense to a lot of people. But I mean, if you get down to like what that argument actually is, it's really like an appeal to numbers. Like
Mm-hmm.
so many people believe a certain thing, therefore
Well,
that's what you should believe.
once again, it's not just an appeal to numbers though, because as we sort of mentioned earlier, you can have a large community consensus in another community, right? Like once again, the flat earthers are very good at this kind of thing. There's quite a lot of consensus there in terms of their beliefs about the Earth, right? Consensus isn't it, right? It's consensus amongst experts. So once again,
Mm-hmm.
it's the expertise that's really driving this. It's really the driving force behind all of this, right? So for the person who is distrusting of science or who is skeptical as to whether or not we should trust science, for them, I think the move is ultimately going to be to challenge this notion of expertise, right? That's at the end of the day going to be the move. I don't really see anywhere else um, that the other camp can use to actually secure this like esteemed place that science has, right? So this is the crux. This is where everything is Everything comes down to this: are scientists
Yeah.
experts in their fields or not?
You can also have situations where, historically, there may have been a minority of scientists who believed a position that we now have adopted,
Right.
where, eugenics was a very popular movement, 100 years ago. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the biggest scientific journals at the time were sort of talking about it in positive ways. So it was very mainstream and based on, a lot of racist assumptions uh, that weren't really challenged at the time. And so you may have had
Mm-hmm.
a minority of scientists saying, uh, we shouldn't believe these things, or these are based on flawed data. Um, and in that situation, the majority opinion, the consensus, we would consider now to be wrong.
Right.
So that situation can happen as well, where the experts are just either misinformed or biased in some way, or there's a selection bias where only people that get to be in these positions are those who believe this consensus opinion, or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly can be cases in which a community of so-called experts can get it wrong, right? Now, one move there is to say, well, if they were that wrong, they weren't experts in the first place, right?
Mhm.
Because in order to have expertise, you need to have something right? You have to get it. You have to get it right. Um, I don't know that I like that move, but it's out there. It's going to make it very difficult, I think, for us to establish
Well,
scientists
it's
as
hard to know that, like,
experts.
if you to be an expert, you have to be right. I mean,
Yeah.
like, how do you possibly
But
know
I mean, at
anything?
the same time, while I mean, we laugh because it's going to make claiming scientists as experts very challenging. But at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, if you suggested the alternate, hey, this person is an expert, even though we don't know if they know anything. We don't know if they have gotten anything right in the past. It's questionable. If you consulted a mechanic who claimed to be an expert, but they could not demonstrate that they had gotten any repair done properly in the past, I'm not sure I would be comfortable calling them an expert. I would like to know that you've produced results before I call you an expert.
Right, but that's the challenging thing about science, especially fields that are not as good at predicting or good at creating, like,
Mm-hmm.
tangible results that people outside the field can understand. And even in cases where, as we talked about Newton before, he produced all these tangible results
Mm-hmm.
with his theories, and many of which turned out to be wrong. So even if you are successful, you can't say that they're right necessarily.
It's true. Yeah, I don't know. So much seems to ride on this issue of expertise, and I'm still not clear myself how to break it down. I think so far the most appealing thing we've come across is to say that, well, when you go to these institutions, you get some kind of education. You're not just learning what people have said. Most of the time, I guess this varies by discipline, but most of the time you're involved with some kind of hands-on work, like in a lab or something like that. So you actually get to see the fruits of your inquiry, right? You're not just taking someone's word for it. You're not just watching a video like this one and accepting what the people have said. You're actually uh, doing experiments, seeing the results yourself. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but like, you can think of expertise not just in terms of science, but also in any number of fields, like, history, uh, or any other real academic discipline. You would say these people are experts in that field, but they might be even less able to produce tangible
mm,
results. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, it extends beyond the problem of scientific expertise.
yeah, the problem
But
might just be of expertise in general, one of expertise
mm,
in general, right? What does it take to be an expert in anything? Um, But I mean, at that point, you know, are you ever going to take anyone's word for anything, right? Um, if you're willing to dismiss expertise across the board, you don't have enough time in the day to research everything yourself, right?
right. Well, I think we've been going for a while, so maybe we should start to wrap up. And I would prefer not to wrap up on a, we shouldn't trust experts kind of note. if possible.
Well, it's not we shouldn't trust experts. It's what's an expert?
Right.
What is an
It
expert?
is an important question. It's finding it's hard to really pin down.
I think in order to not wrap up on a note like that, let me return to a note that I made earlier that I promised we would return to. So this last Twitter conversation that we saw, the original commenter makes the claim that just merely trusting in the results of science is like the most unscientific thing you can do, right? He's suggesting this because science is supposed to be like skeptical by nature, right? Scientists are supposed to be skeptics, and therefore, if you want to do good science, you should question their results, right? Again, I want to press this issue. That's fine, right? Science is supposed to be skeptical. There is supposed to be this element of fallibilism and revisability that's incorporated into, well, more or less any sort of scientific practice that I know of. But if you are going to attack the results of established science using this, you ought to remain consistent, right? You ought to apply these same standards to the views that you hold, right? So it's not going to be okay to dismiss scientific findings using this move, but then accept some other move dogmatically, right? Just because it happens to align with something else that you believe, right? If you're going to be a skeptic, and you're going to be like a skeptic, right? Then you ought to be skeptical about everything. Otherwise, you ought to begin to question your own motivations, right?
Right. So if you want to be skeptical of something like the theory of evolution, and using some of the points we brought up earlier, where just because it could be successful, or maybe we can't think of a good way, it could be wrong. That's not good enough to say that it's absolutely true. At the same time, if you want to bring up any alternative theories, all the points that we've mentioned apply to that as well, and probably more so because it's doesn't have as much work and thought put into it, almost certainly. And so you don't get to just reject the consensus view and then insert whatever you want. You also have to be skeptical of that other view as well.
Exactly. A more concrete example, concrete recent example, right? The use of ivermectin as a treatment, right? We'll dismiss the conventional treatment or immunizations because we're skeptical of the science, right? We're skeptical of maybe even of science in general, but we will welcome this other theory, right? That purports to use the same sort of method, right? So it's apply the standard universally, right? It's okay to question scientific results. Perhaps you even should if you want to do good science, right? That kind of just is what peer review is, after all, is questioning another scientist's results, right? And their methodology, etc. It's fine. That's what you should do. But don't merely apply it to that theory, that conclusion, right? You also apply the same manner of thinking elsewhere. Now, yeah, we are unfortunately out of time, but there's so much more to talk about here, right? We've hardly touched on any of the sociological issues, and there's a lot more to say. So maybe we'll return to this sooner than later.
Right. Well, yeah, if you have anything you would like to hear us talk about, or you disagree with anything we've said here, or think you have any kind of better ideas, or want to run something by us, send us a comment or an email, and we might refer to that in a future episode. Yeah, there's, like you said, there's a ton more we could talk about here. Could go for like 2 or 3 hours easily. So.
Yeah.
But we're not doing it for your sake.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's it.